It's February, and I've been spending each Thursday night and Saturday morning at kids basketball. So 6 p.m. to 8:30 practice for all of our kids. 8:30 to 11:45 a.m. Saturday mornings, watching 3 of my children and other people's children between the ages of 7 and 12 playing basketball. Or that's what they call it, right? So I know all of you are jealous. I'll let you know the tickets are free. You can come, and but you might wonder, why do we do that? Why do we spend hours each week this winter play basketball? Well, one thing, winter is pretty long, and you need your kids running around, working off that energy, because basketball is a pretty good thing, for that. It's another reason. Why else might it be good for my kids to play basketball? They're going to be tall. Yeah, I'm not like trying to purposely raise NBA kids or anything. They're not going to be that good. We're not that coordinated, Ann and I. They are going to be tall, so basketball is something they could try to do. They teach lessons of teamwork, cooperation. There's certain things you can get. It's good to know how to dribble and pass and shoot, but there's these things that you can do only together in that kind of place. And so you learn lessons about teamwork, communication, but also how to win and how to lose, how to respond to different things, where you fall short and where you succeed. And, one of the great things about basketball and sports in general is, in most cases, it can't be faked. I know, you're thinking, okay, there's referees, there's players, especially in soccer, who just flop. But in most ways, you either make the basket or you make the goal or you don't. You either win the game or you lose, and there's a score at the end. And there's a simplicity to that I think many of us appreciate. There's no baloney in general. There's less baloney in sports than in other places. And there's a score. There's a winner, there's a loser, and then there's a practice coming up where you can improve and you can get better at shooting and passing. You don't do so well, you can go forward and you can learn from that. You can grow, you can develop. Now, at first glance, my kids playing basketball and the story of Cain and Abel don't seem to match up very well, unless a kid dies on the court. That doesn't happen, thankfully. It's not the Pistons versus Celtics in the 1980s. There's not that level of violence, but there is a connection between these things. We see in sports with the kids, and it's great how their emotions are raw. You see it. They experience jealousy, anger, depression, anxiety about one's status. Where do I fit in? Pride, shame in your good or bad performance. All these things are out there on the basketball court, and when you go home, dealing with hurt feelings, learning how to encourage one another, receiving encouragement, learning to change your thoughts so you don't spiral out of control into depression, resentment. It's all in basketball. It's all in Genesis chapter 4, here with Cain and Abel. So I'm going to go through it. But before we go to the story of Cain and Abel, we need to backtrack to where we were. The end of Genesis 3 last week. We saw the man and the woman eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God announces the consequences for their rebellion. And there's a conclusion at the end of the chapter. You can follow along, verse 22 of chapter 3. And the Lord God said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever." So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. And after he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So we see Adam and Eve cast out of the garden, away from the tree of life, the consequence of their sin. They could no longer live forever. So henceforth, men and women banned from the tree of life until God himself would open up another way. We see the tree of life. Anyone know where we see that? Next Revelation. There's a tree of life. But until then, there's a barrier. And at this point, there's a flaming sword and cherubim. What are cherubim? They're warrior angels. And they're special angels that protect the holy things of God. Where else we see the cherubim? We see them on top of the Ark of the Covenant, right? So you may see pictures of the Ark depicted. There's angels on top. They're kind of protecting the holy things, the things you don't come near without a sacrifice of blood. So the high priest would go in only with a sacrifice as prescribed by God, with shed blood. And so symbolizing the cherubim, this warrior angel saying, no, you don't have full unhindered fellowship with God anymore. And only by the blood of the spotless Lamb, Jesus, can we enter again Eden. That's the destiny in the future. So the tree of life. So God promised salvation when he laid out the consequences for sin. He did make a promise when he spoke to the serpent, and I will put enmity between you and the woman. This is Genesis 3:15. And between her offspring and hers, he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So this is God promising salvation would come in the future. The serpent would be defeated. But here in Genesis 4, we're not there yet. Promise is into the future that Adam and Eve don't know how far. But they start their family in a more foreboding land than where they were. They're no longer in Eden. So they start their family, as was just read earlier. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. The name Cain means to acquire. So I have acquired a man, Cain, with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So we see Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel. In all likelihood, by the time they grew up and had an offering, they probably had other children, but the scriptures don't say that. Because the scriptures here in Genesis want to focus on the story of Cain and Abel. What's going on with them? The brothers grew up long enough for them to have some aptitude with their respective vocations. Cain, a worker of the ground, or otherwise a farmer. Abel, a keeper of a flock, sheep, perhaps goats, things like that. So at this point, at some point, they offer offerings to God. We don't have an order of service of what that was supposed to look like, but they knew they were supposed to give a sacrifice to God in worship. And the text says, it just says God had regard or looked with favor or paid attention to Abel's offering, but not Cain's. That's all it says. It's very, very terse. We don't get all the details. And the question comes up, why did God accept Abel's offering but not Cain's? Genesis doesn't explicitly say. Verse 4 may give us a hint. Abel gave what? The firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. And then Cain, he gave a sacrifice of grain or fruit or produce, but it doesn't say anything about the value of his sacrifice. It wasn't necessarily the first fruits or the best pieces of wherever he grew. So perhaps Cain withheld the best that he had, unlike Abel, who offered the best that he had. Maybe Cain offered his leftovers. Hebrews, the New Testament book, it says that Abel's sacrifice was more acceptable. Why? Because Cain didn't have the faith that Abel had. It says, by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice. So it was Abel's faith so Cain made a sacrifice, but perhaps it was empty and ritualistic. That seems to be what Jesus implied when he talked about sacrifices and why they might be accepted or acceptable or not. He quoted Hosea a couple times, "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." Jesus, in other words, is saying, burnt offering, sacrifice, it's okay, but it's mercy or loving kindness, covenant love, a relationship that I desire more than the rituals. Rituals can be good insofar as they express what's in your heart. So if you have an active relationship like Abel seemed to have, he was acceptable of that sacrifice. And it applies to us. We don't have blood sacrifices. We don't offer grain offerings as incense, but we do have rituals. Just even coming here is a ritual in a sense. Coming to church, participating in the fellowship, giving money or giving your time, serving in the name of God. It's all something done, an offering, a sacrifice to God, but it's when is it valuable? When it comes from a heart of faith. When it's saying, you don't necessarily have to have amazing feelings about it, but you're not trying to play games. In other sense, I do this, God, so you do that. And perhaps that was in the heart of Cain. And nothing in the Bible says Abel was a perfect human being. I think growing up in the church, you can think, oh yeah, Abel was this perfect angel who just walked on clouds. And he also always listened to worship music, and his heart was always aflutter with love for God. It doesn't say that. All it says is that he did what he understood God wanted. That he didn't play games. He offered sacrifices that he thought that God would want, and God said, yeah, I honor that. I honor your faith in that way. So Cain makes his offering, like Abel, but somehow he gets a message God doesn't approve. And he's not understanding what happened or why God might not accept him. He's confused. He says, why me? Why me? Why is he doing so much better than me? Why am I not successful? You ever feel that way? Even pastors can feel that way. Why is that pastor? So, why is that church doing this? Why is that all this comparison, jealousy, anger, depression? I think all of us can relate to those kinds of feelings. And God, he's not surprised by it. And he's like, okay, I'm gonna go in to Cain, this man that I love. And this is a critical moment in his life. And he gives Cain a real choice. How will you respond, Cain, to this disappointment? So verse 6 of chapter 4, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. This is the key interaction. Even before what Cain does to Abel, God tells Cain, sin is doing what? It's crouching, it's prowling, it's waiting like prey, like a predator for prey. So sin is personalized. It's some scholars think there's kind of something demonic going on, but yeah, that's what sin does. This anger that has been festering, that you're letting fester, It wants to consume you like a predator with prey. Lion crouching. That Crouching Tiger movie, that's what sin does. It wants to consume you, but you must rule over it. So God's saying, you have a choice, Cain. Are you going to give in to this? You going to let it destroy you, consume you? Or are you going to rule over it, have dominion, like I told Adam, and then thus to you, have dominion over lesser things? And this is the reality of sin. Sin is not something we can take lightly. Any sin can undo us. It can make us its servant, its slave. 1 Peter 5, you may be familiar with the passage in the New Testament. He says, be self-controlled and alert. This is Peter talking to Christians, people who know Jesus personally, but he's saying even us, we need to be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Perhaps Peter had this knowledge, this understanding of the story of Cain. The same imagery. The devil is prowling to devour you. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kind of sufferings. So in our fallen world, yes, even Christians will have temptations. Our flesh is still with us, and the weaknesses that we have, the desires to transgress God's design. So the devil seizes upon those weaknesses in our flesh, and he amplifies them. He whispers in our ear, or he shouts to get our attention, and the sin comes at us and says, you can have your way right away. You can take matters into your own hands. You can take control and defy God. After all, you're supposed to rule, right? Sin tells us there's this lie that if we defy God, we can take God's place as judge, jury, and executioner. And we can do it without consequence. We can be in charge. And so God knows what sin is doing. And he interrupts and says, hey, Cain, you have a real choice here. You don't have to let this sin eat you alive. This bitterness, this jealousy. That's why God said, you can rule over this sin. You can listen to me. You can take my word and humbly accept it and decide this pattern is going to stop. This spiral I keep going in, this cycle of bitterness, feeding bitterness and anger, leading to violence, it can be stopped. But you need to decide, yes, that pattern, that sin must die before I do. You have to make that decision. So how could Cain mastered his sin instead of vice versa, being mastered by his sin? What could he done? Well, at this point, Cain could have leveled with God with this intervention. It's like, yeah, I am a rageaholic. You noticed. Yeah, you're coming at me now. I see the light. I'm gonna, come to Jesus. And Jesus is in the future. But yeah, have this moment where I acknowledge my bitter jealousy. I hate my brother. I just need to say it. I need to confess to God. Be clean. Come clean. And God, I'm angry with you. Why didn't you accept my offering? That's not fair. And he needs to articulate that and engage God and ask him, why didn't you do that? And also let God speak to him. Hey, Cain, here's why I didn't accept your offering. Your heart's not in the right place. You've been festering this rivalry with your brother. You're depending upon yourself and your own thoughts rather than me. This is a time. This is an opportunity to come back to me. You can face the reality of your unbelief. You can rely on my mercy and my faithfulness. You can experience forgiveness with God, with your family, with these people. But instead of engagement with God, being willing to change, what does Cain decide to do? He decides to rely on myself. No, I'm gonna go forward with this. I'm gonna let this anger take me over, and the energy it provides, it gets me going. Some of us, that's what we live on. We're living on this anger. We're going to prove the other people wrong, jealousy, and Cain gives in. Verse 8, Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Very to the point. Some manuscripts say Cain said to his brother, let's go to the field, and there in the field, Cain killed his brother, but it's so he has this intention to go to the field to murder his brother. And like his parents, Adam and Eve, Cain had this choice. And like his parents, Cain failed miserably. Just as Eve let the serpent rule over her, Cain let his sin consume him and cause harm he couldn't imagine. Verse 9, the aftermath begins. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Remind you of anything after that last week, right? Where are you, Adam? Why are you hiding? You know, not because God doesn't know, but he's all about engagement, all about, let's have this relationship. Let's come clean. And Cain said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? So God calls out to him like Adam. Cain says, I don't know. He adds to his murder, his jealousy, his rage. He adds lying. And then he adds an exaggeration. I don't know, God, am I my brother's keeper? Some parents understand that, right? You asked me to clean my room? You didn't ask, am I supposed to clean the whole house for you? Am I your slave? No, I just asked you this one thing. Don't kill your brother. You don't have to be your brother's keeper. That wasn't your responsibility, but Cain exaggerates this whole thing. God, you're so unreasonable. No. Keeping Cain and Abel is God's job. That he is the one who keeps people. We keep commandments. The Old Testament says this word keeper is never applied for one brother to keep another, except for this question. God is the one who keeps Israel, Psalm 121 says, who will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. So Cain tries to pass the buck with exaggeration, and God calls out his baloney. Verse 10, and the Lord said, what have you done? He's pressing in. I need to engage. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So Cain could never imagine this as being the result. Like last week, we saw how Adam and Eve eating of the fruit is like the Pandora's box story that's told, unleashing all these things that we could never imagine. All I just wanted was this. Obviously, if I got rid of Abel, everything would be better. If I scapegoat him, but the consequences reverberate and multiply. And God's saying, Cain, you thought you were angry and depressed before? You ain't seen nothing yet. After letting sin have its way with you, giving into this resentment, building it in, and saying, yeah, it's powerful. It makes me do these things. No, it's going to lead you to darkness and destruction you've never seen before. You think knocking off your brother will solve all your problems? It will just multiply them by 10 and then some. If you let jealousy or resentment consume you, your life will be fruitless and alone. That's what he's saying. You're wandering. The ground will not produce anymore for you like it was. So no longer do you have your vocation, working the ground like you used to. You can no longer move in society. You'll be ostracized like a criminal because you have given in. Rage has consumed you. And these pronouncements, they're just the consequences of what happens when sin rules over us. That's what God is saying. This is making it clear. I read a book I got for Christmas. It was kind of interesting. It's called from Billy Hallowell, Playing with Fire, a modern investigation into demons, exorcisms, and ghosts. Great reading for when right before you want to go to sleep. And some stories are rather hair-raising. People speaking in weird voices, different kinds of stuff, stuff being thrown from walls. And it talks about the demonic and things demons do to get our attention. But the conclusion is there's different Christian ministers that talk and say, really, all this stuff, this evil stuff happens. Why? At some point, people open themselves up to their influence. At some point, they said, okay, I will let sin consume me in this way. I will let it rule over me. And so it happens. It happens in their life. And in order for people to be freed from whatever is going on, they need, yes, God to work, but they need to also give permission to be freed. Everything happens in the spiritual level with some level of cooperation. People yielding themselves one way or another to God and his freedom, or to these other spirits and their slavery that will consume them eventually. And that's what we see going on with Cain. And we see it in our own lives. So Cain, after the consequences of this is made known to him in verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, this is some mercy God gives. "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put his mark on Cain, said no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So Cain, he's apologetic after he's caught in his sin. And he cries out for mercy. And the amazing thing, God gives him mercy. Yes, he's banished from the land he farmed, the society he enjoyed. He settles in this land of Nod. Nod literally means land of wandering. And presumably, he figures his other brothers, his nephews perhaps, they would seek to avenge Abel's murder. So God says, yeah, that may happen. So I'm going to extend this mercy to you in the midst of judgment. And he gave Cain a mark or a sign. We don't know what that looked like, but people would see that and they'd say, oh, God is protecting him. I'm not going to mess with Cain. So Cain had this mark of protection. So, his story is not completely over. It keeps going on. But also, the sign would teach everyone a lesson. Don't be like Cain. Don't give in to resentment. Don't let the anger you have make you do stupid things. Seek God and his truth, no matter how painful it may seem. Don't be like that. See the mark of Cain wandering around? Don't give in to your anger, your pride, your lust, your need for approval, because all of those things will eat you alive. They will make you a shell of the person you were before. Now today we know about people leaving their Christian faith, talking about things in the Bible, church and politics, criticizing a church. Now, people need, the church has lots of things to be critical about, and we need to hear it. But I think what's missing sometimes in these discussions is the role sin plays in people's lives, losing their faith, how those seeds of bitterness can be watered. And it grows and it grows. And people get tired. They get apathetic. They want to give in to their flesh. It's very understandable. We prefer lies that flatter us to truth that calls out our baloney. We sometimes keep to ourselves. We neglect Christian fellowship. That bitterness, discouragement continues to grow within us. The sin festers. And so, sin, all kinds of sin can consume us, but perhaps the most destructive is this one of bitterness and resentment. Because it's so easy to justify. My anger is righteous. I know what's right. I'm right to be angry. It's so easy to do that. And we see it permeating our world everywhere. We see it in our society, right and left, politics. our families, our churches. I know it's right. I'm right to be angry, and I'm going to take it out on everyone else. And when people are possessed by anger, no matter what anger, whatever it is, look out, right? Look out. All you can do, you can't reason with them, right? You can't reason someone out of it. You have to pray. You just have to have patience and say, hey, Lord, I'm going to take this angry person where it is. Just do what I can to share love, to not respond in kind. But whenever, all of us are susceptible to this. All of us can be guilty of this. Wherever there's anger, we need to nip it in the bud. Perhaps tone down our social media use. Come to God and His Word. Put on some worship music. Whatever we need to do to nip that anger in the bud, level up with God and with one another. Come into the light. As James says, know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to become angry. Why? Because the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. That's what God did with Cain. That's what He can do with us. He says, you just need to receive this word I have for you with humility. So Cain is marked by God's protection and humility even after he failed. He can also do that for us. He can mark us. So we know, yes, sin, we can't be naive to sin. In our flesh, we can't rule over sin, but Christ and His Word can enable us to be more than conquerors over sin. That the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead by His gospel is now living in us. And while we live in the agony of our flesh, in a place of wandering, we can also live in the triumph of God's kingdom. So as men and women, boys and girls, made in God's image, we are made to rule the earth under God's rule over us. We are not to let these things consume us. Yes, we blew the game yesterday. We blew the wide open layup. We were embarrassed. And we let our anger have our way with us, but today's a new day. God can interrupt those cycles. He calls us back to Himself, to live as His sons and daughters, to know our destiny, that even though we sin, we've blown it, God redeems us through the death of Christ. He gives us power through His Holy Spirit, so we don't have to be ruled by our sin. Even if our parents were ruled by it too. Even if, well, I only know to be angry. I only know to be this way. That can be broken by the grace of God, by the power of God. And it says, we just have to agree. Okay, God, this is where I am. I need to agree to your rescue. I let you fill me and free me from these chains, from these other spirits. If we trust His word, He will save. But if we give ourselves to sin, God will let us face the wages of our sin. As He said to Cain, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Let us pray. Father,